Inflation is everything. Inflation is absolutely everything in the modern economy. Friedman knew this deeply. Inflation destroys entire economies. Inflation destroys accumulated assets. Inflation steals specifically from the poor. Friedman spent his entire life urgently warning, you need to understand inflation completely, deeply, radically, because inflation is an invisible enemy, because inflation constantly erodes purchasing power, because inflation is a deliberate government weapon. Friedman urgently emphasized, most people do not genuinely understand inflation. Most think it is a natural phenomenon. Most don't know what to do. Most suffer silently. Friedman said, you need to know everything about inflation. Because knowledge is true power. Because knowledge protects you completely. Friedman knew that people who understand inflation do not suffer. Because you genuinely protect yourself. Because it acts correctly. Because it thrives. Milton Friedman dedicated his entire career to this critical issue. Friedman studied inflation meticulously. Friedman measured inflation precisely. Friedman patiently explained inflation. Friedman warned about inflation urgently. Friedman knew that inflation is an economic crime. Because it is deliberate government theft, because nobody votes on inflation, because it is invisible secret tax. Friedman emphasized, inflation is more unfair than any other tax, because you don't see it happening, because you don't choose, because it is silent and invisible. Friedman knew that inflation kills the entire economy. Because it erodes fundamental incentives, because it destroys personal savings, because it kills productive investment. Friedman knew economic history. Friedman saw pattern repeat. Friedman knew that inflation always destroys. What truly is inflation in economic terms? Friedman said, inflation is an increase in the quantity of money. Government deliberately prints money. Central bank creates money out of thin air. Friedman emphasized, when there is more money in circulation, each individual dollar is worth less. Because currency is governed by supply and demand. Because with more currency in supply, demand for the same, each one is worth less. Friedman knew that inflation is currency devaluation. Because currency is actually worth much less, because purchasing power drops materially. Friedman warned, inflation is true silent robbery. Because you nominally have money, but money is worth much less, because someone gained to your direct detriment. Friedman knew that inflation is a transfer of wealth, from those who have money to those who print money, from saver to government, from citizen to state. Why does the government deliberately cause inflation? Friedman said, government prints unnecessary currency. Why does the government do this? Because the government wants to spend more than it collects. Because the government doesn't want to increase visible taxes. Because government secretly chooses invisible inflation. Friedman emphasized, government uses inflation to finance spending. Because inflation is an invisible secret tax. Because inflation is perfectly invisible theft. Friedman knew that the central bank follows the government obediently, because the government truly rules, because the central bank is not genuinely independent, because the central bank serves the government. What is the exact mechanism of true inflation? Friedman explained, government spends money. Government legitimately does not have money. Government artificially prints money. Central bank creates currency out of thin air. New currency enters the economy. With more currency in circulation, prices rise materially. Because there's more money. Because each one is worth less. Because sellers charge more. Friedman emphasized, it is simple and irrefutable mathematics. Because extra money necessarily causes extra prices. Because inflation follows currency printing mathematically. Friedman knew that economics does not understand mechanism. Because you think it's natural. Because you don't see printing happening. Because he doesn't see a causal connection. How does inflation directly affect you personally? Friedman warned, inflation radically destroys purchasing power. Your money is worth less every day. Your salary buys much less. Your assets are actually worth less. Friedman emphasized, in 5 years your money could be worth half its value. Because inflation compounded negatively. Because every year it gets progressively worse. Friedman knew that inflation hurts the poor much more, because the poor have no genuine protection. Because poor people have no real assets. Because poor people suffer helplessly. Friedman warned, rich people naturally protect themselves. Because rich people have protected properties. Because rich people have physical gold. Because rich people have valuable shares. Because rich people protect themselves adequately. Why does inflation inevitably cause unemployment? Friedman said, inflation causes economic confusion. Companies don't know the real price. Companies cannot plan. Companies do not invest in new ventures. Companies hire much less. Unemployment increases materially. Friedman emphasized, inflation kills real jobs. Because it kills productive investment. Because it kills economic planning. Friedman knew that the cycle is destructive. Because inflation causes real unemployment. Because unemployment worsens the economy. Because the economy gets much worse. Why does inflation kill personal savings? Friedman warned, if you save, inflation steals your results. Your money is worth less every moment. Your savings decrease in real purchasing power. Friedman emphasized, anyone who saves in currency loses guaranteed. Because currency is constantly devaluing. Because savings die silently. Friedman knew that inflation encourages consumption. Because saving is financial punishment. Because consuming is the best strategy. Because you lose if you wait. Why does inflation kill true investment? Friedman said, investors cannot invest with inflation. Because uncertainty is huge. Because return does not compensate for high risk. Because you don't know real cost. Friedman emphasized, inflation kills economic planning. Because you don't know what's going to happen. Because you can't calculate return. Friedman knew that economics stops with high inflation. Because no one can invest. Because no one can create. Because no one can work productively. What is the difference between expected and unexpected inflation? Friedman explained, expected inflation, you can partially protect yourself. Friedman emphasized, unexpected inflation is a real surprise, because you didn't really expect it. Because you didn't protect yourself properly. Friedman knew that unexpected inflation destroys completely. Because you didn't plan. Because you lose everything. Friedman warned, both are deeply bad, because they both rob you, because both destroy the entire economy. How to protect yourself from inflation effectively? Friedman emphasized true real assets, physical property, physical gold, shares of real companies, own business. Friedman knew that real assets genuinely protect because they grow with inflation, because it maintains purchasing power. Friedman warned nominal currency dies, because nominal radically devalues, because you lose purchasing power. Friedman emphasized you need real assets, because real assets protect you, because real assets last indefinitely. Why doesn't the government ever stop inflating? Friedman said. Because government loves inflation. Because inflation finances spending. Because inflation is invisible. Friedman emphasized the government cannot handle not spending, because government always grows, because the government always wants more. Friedman knew that the cycle never genuinely ends, because the government always prints, because there will always be inflation, because you always need to protect yourself. How do you calculate personal real inflation? Friedman emphasized, official inflation is a lie. Friedman knew, you need to calculate your inflation. Your shopping basket is different. Food, housing, transport. Friedman warned, you spend more on some things, less in others. Friedman knew his inflation is unique, because you consume differently, because you have unique expenses. Friedman emphasized, calculate your inflation, not the government's, because government lies, because government manipulates, because the government always underestimates. What is the real inflation rate that is not manipulated? Friedman warned, consumer price index is a lie. Friedman knew, government manipulates data, because it underestimates prices, because it excludes things, because methodology changes. Friedman emphasized, you need to distrust official numbers, because numbers are fake, because numbers serve government, because numbers hide truth. How does inflation affect insurance and pensions? Friedman warned, your insurance is worth less, your pension buys less. Friedman knew, inflation kills insurance, because coverage is insufficient, because pension is not included, because you are helpless. Why does inflation cause economic boom and bust? Friedman explained, inflation creates false prosperity. Government prints money. Money enters the economy. It seems to grow, but it's an illusion. Then inflation explodes. Unemployment arrives. Economy falls. Friedman knew the cycle is artificial, because boom is fake, because bust is real, because suffering comes later. How does inflation affect the real estate market? Friedman warned, inflation makes properties rise. It seems good, but it's an illusion. Friedman knew, real estate rises nominally, but it rises due to inflation, not for real value. Friedman emphasized, be careful with illusion, because you think you got rich, but it only followed inflation. Why shouldn't you trust the government about inflation? Friedman warned. Government lies deliberately, because the government wants to spend, because the government wants to print, because the government wants to inflate. Friedman knew. Government has an incentive to lie, because lying benefits the government, because the truth harms the government, because government is not honest. How does inflation affect real wages? Friedman warned. Your salary does not keep up with inflation. Friedman knew, nominal wages rise, purchasing power falls, UF becomes poorer. Friedman emphasized, you work the more you earn nominally, but actually buy less, because inflation eats up difference. Friedman knew you are in a losing race, because salary is left behind, because inflation always wins. Why does inflation cause higher inflation later? Friedman explained, inflation generates expectations. Expectations cause higher prices. Higher prices cause higher inflation. Vicious cycle creates spiral. Friedman knew expectations are real because people anticipate, because people adjust prices, because inflation is self-perpetuating. How does inflation specifically destroy the middle class? Friedman warned. The middle class suffers especially because you have savings. Savings are destroyed because he has a house. House is expensive. Because there is no gold, there's no protection. Friedman knew the middle class is the perfect victim because there is something, but not enough. Because you can't protect yourself. What is the relationship between inflation and interest rates? Friedman explained, central bank raises interest rates. Why? To combat inflation. High interest rates destroy the economy. Unemployment increases. Friedman knew solution creates new problem. Because you can't solve inflation with interest. Because inflation comes from printing. Because interest doesn't really help. Why does inflation affect credit and loans? Friedman warned, with inflation you cannot lend. Because uncertainty is great. Because return is uncertain. Because you lose money. Friedman knew credit dries up with inflation. Because no one lends. Because business cannot grow. Because the economy stops. How to protect yourself from inflation through education. Friedman emphasized, education is protection. Because educated earns more. Because an educated person understands economics. Because politeness protects itself. Friedman knew education is the best defense. Because educated people understand inflation. Because polite acts correctly. Because educated people prosper despite inflation. Why is inflation a generational wealth transfer? Friedman warned, you are not affected. Their children are affected most. Their grandchildren suffer even more. Friedman knew inflation today kills the future. Because accumulated wealth disappears. Because the next generation starts from scratch. Because you steal their future. What's the uncomfortable truth about inflation that the government doesn't want you to know? Friedman said, inflation is deliberate. It's no accident. It's not natural. Friedman emphasized, government wants inflation. Because it finances expenses. Because the government hides real spending. Because people don't see the truth. Friedman knew the truth is government steals from you systematically, silently, legally. What is the long-term cost of inflation to society? Friedman warned, cost is absolutely civilizational. Because it kills personal savings. Because it kills productive investment. Because it kills creative work. Friedman emphasized, inflation kills the entire economy. Because it kills fundamental incentives. Because it kills economic production. Friedman knew that inflation kills collective prosperity. Because no one can create. Because no one can invest. Because everyone becomes progressively poorer. Why does inflation affect rich and poor people completely differently? Friedman said, rich people have multiple protections. Friedman emphasized, the poor have no genuine protection. Friedman knew that inflation is regressive because it harms those who cannot protect themselves, because it specifically harms the poor, because it specifically benefits the rich. Friedman warned, inflation worsens inequality materially. Because rich people grow disproportionately. Because the poor fall disproportionately. Friedman knew that inflation is absolute economic injustice. Okay. What do you need to understand about inflation completely and deeply? Inflation is deliberate and intentional currency printing. Inflation steals purchasing power systematically and relentlessly. Inflation is a non-accidental government weapon. Inflation causes genuine, real unemployment. Inflation kills personal savings irrevocably. Inflation kills productive investment completely. Inflation progressively kills the entire economy. Inflation harms the poor specifically and systematically. Inflation benefits the rich disproportionately and unfairly. Inflation worsens inequality dramatically. Inflation is perfectly silent theft. Inflation is a formally legal government crime. Inflation invariably follows a historical pattern. Inflation self-perpetuates exponentially. Inflation affects future generations permanently. Friedman knew all this deeply. Friedman proved this rigorously. Friedman warned about this urgently. A person who understands inflation protects themselves genuinely and adequately. People who don't understand suffer silently and inevitably. People who ignore inflation slowly lose everything. A person who acts on inflation prospers eternally. Friedman spent a lifetime warning with extreme urgency. You need to understand inflation completely now, because inflation will always inevitably come. Because inflation never genuinely stops. Because you absolutely need to be prepared. Friedman emphasized, prepare now immediately without delay. Because inflation comes unexpectedly without warning. Because you need to protect yourself now in the present. Because protection takes time to genuinely implement. Friedman knew that you can completely protect yourself if you learn genuinely and fully, if you act immediately without delay, if you protect yourself adequately in all aspects. Now you truly know everything about inflation. Now you know genuinely uncomfortable truth. Now you know that the government systematically steals from you. Now you know that inflation is a weapon against you. Now you know that rich people protect themselves and you don't. Now you know you need to act immediately. Now you choose your destiny completely. Ignore inflation and inevitably suffer, or protect yourself and prosper. Choice is in your hands absolutely. Friedman knew that right choice saves you financially forever. Friedman knew that the wrong choice progressively destroys you. Friedman knew that you have the power to choose. Friedman knew that knowledge is true power. Friedman knew you can do it. So start now, immediately, this moment. Learn about inflation thoroughly. Understand true mechanism. Protect your assets properly. Buy true real assets. Escape from counterfeit nominal currency. Build real wealth that lasts. Because your future absolutely depends on it. Because your family depends on it. Because your financial freedom depends on it. Because your dignity depends on it.